Hello everyone, you're listening to America Meditating Radio. We collect wisdom, inspire each other, and empower hearts on demand 24/7. I'm Sister Jenna, host of the syndicated America Meditating Radio. Join us as we talk one-on-one with leading experts who answer life's most compelling questions. Because in a world of uncertainty, we need answers right here, right now. America Meditating Radio, a show for everyone to learn more about this amazing thing called life. Do you like to meditate? Have you tried to meditate? Have you struggled with meditation? Why don't you visit one of the Brahma Kumaris Meditation Center? Visit brahmakumaris.org. Over 30,000 homeless children live in the streets of La Paz, Bolivia. Most of these children live on the bridges and cemeteries or wherever they can find shelter. They eat whatever they can find, steal or beg. Father Joseph Maria Neuenhofer, a German priest, has dedicated his entire life in helping these children. For the last 23 years, Foundation Arco-Iris, founded and led by Father Neuenhofer, has helped thousands of these children in providing shelter, food, education, and medical care through the Foundation's hospitals. For more information and to donate to Foundation Arco-Iris, go to www.arcoirisamerica.org.
I have been illusion.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to America Meditating Radio. That was Lucinda Drayton from her Bliss CD. And the title of that track is Lifted. Don't you love it? Kind of brings you in a better atmosphere and in a better mood. Yesterday I had a very beautiful conversation with Stephan Schwartz, and I had to ask him to come back on the air to have us have a part two. Stephan spoke a lot about the social transformation that we're witnessing today and the many similarities that we witness in our generations, which sometimes might seem new to me. And what's interesting is, as I was listening to Stephan, I kept thinking to myself, but is there anything new now that we could do? In my mind, as I'm listening to Stephan, because we've had the Science March, we've had the Women's March, we're having the Climate Change March. This weekend we're having marches after marches after marches. And a lot of people have told me that they don't think it really did much in terms of sharing the message that they felt it could have shared. And I really don't understand what they mean, other than I don't know if there is an action that was to be taken, or is it that folks are just looking for something specific? So I was a little bit lost when, and these are intellectual folks that are telling me that they thought that they missed the mark. So I've been sitting with that. And after speaking to Stephan, I was wondering what are some of the things that maybe he can lend us in this conversation about areas that we could amplify the story. One is that I know time plays a significant role. You can have great ideas, but you're either way ahead of the time, and so you've kind of planted those seeds for others to come and water and germinate, and eventually you'll look back 20 years later and go, I had already said that and done that. So we're aware of progressive thinkers. We're aware of people who are ahead of their time. But now we have something that we didn't have in the 50s. We didn't have it in the 60s. We didn't have it in the 70s or the 80s. We've got something called social media. And social media has taken us to a completely different level of communication and a completely different level of relating to each other. And as much as I appreciate social media, I've even found myself moving so fast that I don't even value what the next message is, or I don't experience it as deep as if George Washington was to send a letter to Congress, which would take much longer than now if Donald Trump was to send a letter to Congress, which would take only a second. So the point that I'm making is that I wonder if it's more of a spiritual awakening that's needed for us to be able to move forward, because there's a sense or a feeling that we're going backwards. And maybe it's actually a signal that we have moved spiritually backward. So we're looking at the times where history repeats itself, where women's rights are being taken away from them, where our environment is no longer being cared for, where politics perhaps needs more transparency. And so what is it that's needed? That will be my conversation with Stephan today, to go deeper into it. And so our return guest today is Stephan Schwartz, and we've had such a rich conversation yesterday, Stephan. Thank you so much for taking the time to come back on the air. Stephan, for those of you who don't know, is a distinguished consulting faculty of Saybrook University and a research associate at the Laboratories for Fundamental Research. He is a columnist for the journal Explorer and editor of the daily web publication schwartzreport.net, in both of which he covers trends that are affecting the future. For 40 years, he has been studying the nature of consciousness, particularly that aspect independent of space and time. He's a part of a small group that founded Modern Remote Viewing Research, which our producer, Antonia, wants to hear everything about, and is the principal researcher studying the use of remote viewing in archaeology. Stephan, thank you so much for coming back on the air. As you can see, I really loved our conversation yesterday.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you this morning.
So, Antonia wanted me to hit right at this area of a research that many of us really don't know about. You've been using something called remote viewing to examine the future, and I understand that you've been getting people to remote view even as far as the year 2015. I mean, I can really deal with 2017, and you have people going all the way to 2050. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with remote viewing, such as myself, could you tell us a little bit more about how it actually works, and what types of trends have you found as a result of using it? What's ahead for humanity, Stephan?
Well, which one do you want to start with first? What remote viewing is, or what we've discovered?
Remote viewing.
Well,
remote viewing.
But we need some order. Which would you like to start with?
Remote viewing.
Okay, remote viewing is a technique. It's actually a protocol. Those of us in the early 70s, 1970s, there was an effect that was occurring in research literature called the decline effect. And basically what it was that you ask people to do things that non-local consciousness task performance is what most people call psychic. It's a word I almost never use. But in any case, you ask people to do tasks like that, and what would happen over time is that their capacity to perform successfully would decrease. That's why it was called the decline effect. And nobody could quite figure it out. And then in the early 70s, when it had become a real crisis problem, a small group of us, a handful of guys, myself, Hal Puthoff, Ed May, Russell Targ at SRI, Bob John, Roger Nelson at Princeton, a little group of people, we began to ask the question, well, maybe the reason that people have a decline effect is that the tasks that we're asking them to do are boring. And nobody does well at things that they're bored with. So the challenge was, how do you structure an experiment that is scientifically valid, that is, it's properly blinded and randomized, and so that the protocol precludes anything other than non-local consciousness providing the answer. Non-local consciousness is that aspect of consciousness that is not physiologically based. That is, it exists independent of space and time. When you ask people to access that part of themselves, how can you do this in a rigorous way that is scientifically valid, but that doesn't get boring and that therefore they lose their ability to do it? And what we came up with was what we now call remote viewing, a term that was coined in about 71 or 72 by a New York artist who was one of the early remote viewers, a man named Ingo Swann. At that point, I was calling it distant viewing, but it's been around for a long time. The oldest recorded remote viewing is in the 46th chapter of Herodotus, his Histories of the World, and that dates to the 5th century BCE. So it's been around a long time. I mean, people have long traditions of this. A lot of it gets wound into occult beliefs and things like that, this sort of ritualized beliefs. But basically, we weren't interested in the sort of cultural part. What we wanted to know was, could we design a system that would allow us to do it? And the answer was, yes, you can. The SRI program was funded by the government, and it was principally a spying program. They used remote viewers to spy on the Soviet Union. I was interested in using it in archaeology and used it to find Cleopatra's Palace and Mark Antony's Palace and the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and one of Christopher Columbus's caravels from his 4th voyage, and the Brig Leander, and a bunch of other stuff. And then I got interested in looking at the future because I had been on the MIT Secretary of Defense discussion group on innovation technology in the future. I was in the government at that point as the special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations. Anyway, so I began to think about, well, could you use this to look at the future and use it to help guide people? And when I began doing research, because before I do an experiment, I try to find out everything that's ever been done before in the same area, what I discovered was that if you get too far ahead, nobody can understand what you're talking about. And to give you an example of that, we all know Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, one of the greats. Every child reads this book. I guess they still read it. Anyway, it was wildly popular for almost a century. And after Jules Verne, a French writer, had published it, and it was such a huge success, his editor asked him, what else have you got? And he said, well, I wrote this novel about Paris in the 1960s. Now, we're speaking here, he's in the 1850s. And so he said, well, send it to me, and he did. And this is a novel in which Verne describes Paris in the 1960s as a city where corporations dominate business. Corporations didn't exist at that time in that way. That women are active in business, unheard of in France at that time. That people drove around in vehicles that didn't require horses, internal combustion machines, and that the city was dominated by this huge metal tower. Eiffel Tower hadn't been built yet, and that and this is the exact way he described it, and that business correspondence was sent via facsimile machines. Actually used the word facsimile machine. Anyway, he turned this into his editor, and his editor wrote him back and said, Jules, as both your friend and your editor, this is just too crazy. Nobody would believe this. This is so off the wall. My recommendation to you is to just put this away someplace and forget about it. And that's what he did. And there he put it in a little vault, which nobody knew about at the time. And then in the early 1990s, an heir of Verne's inherited a property, a rural property in France. And when he went out to see this thing that he had inherited, in one of the barns, he found under a table this little safe. And he said to the farmer, what's in the safe? And the guy said, well, I don't know. Nobody knows. It's been there for a long time. My father was the farmer before me. He didn't know. You know, just was incurious about it. But the heir was very curious, and so he had a locksmith come out and open it up, and that's how we know this story I just told you about this, because they found the manuscript and the correspondence with the editor. So I was that's an example of the sort of thing I'm talking about. Anyway, in 1978, we were, in the minds of many people, facing the real potential of nuclear Holocaust crisis. I mean, it's hard to remember now, but
now more than ever,
a very big deal. Yeah. And so I thought, well, could we look at the future and see whether there is, in fact, a nuclear Holocaust? And I didn't want to go too far ahead because you wouldn't understand what they were saying, so I chose the year 2050, because I figured if I went far enough ahead to answer my question, but not so far ahead that I wouldn't understand the answer, that seemed about the right time frame, given how things develop. And so from 1978 to 1996, I had about 4,000 people in about 12 different countries do remote viewings of the year 2050 on the same date as the day I did the experiment. So today is the 25th of April. So a typical thing would be, Sister Jenna, I would like you to go forward in time to the 25th of April, 2050. You're standing in front of the place where you sleep. Now, the problem with doing these kinds of experiments is, and this is hard to learn for a lot of people, is that you have to ask questions that do not contain a cue as to the answer you're seeking. So you'll notice in that first thing I just said, I didn't say you're standing in front of the house where you sleep, because maybe in 2050 everybody lives in condos. I don't know. So you have to ask your questions so that they don't contain the suggestion of an answer. So the way you would do it is your life size. That turns out to be important because we know from other research that people can get down to the submolecular level. So you want to give them the cue that they're life size, and that you're standing in front of the place where you sleep, because everybody sleeps, but you'll see what the answer is. Anyway, so I have done this all over the world, literally, as I say, in about a dozen countries, and they all tell basically the same story, which at the time I didn't understand at all. Even though it was only 50 years ahead, some of it I could understand, but a lot of it I couldn't understand. For instance, one of the questions I had, because I was concerned about nuclear war, was, well, what's happening with the Soviet Union? And they would say things like, well, it's disappeared. And I just, Martians came down and ripped it up and took it away? I mean, how could that be? Because at those days, we thought of the Soviet Union as this great monolithic power, And they would say, well, it doesn't exist anymore. Of
Right.
course, that's true. I mean, now you look back on it and say, well, of course, that's but it was not at all obvious. So then I would say things like, well, then is the world safer? And they would say, no, the world is much more dangerous. And I said, well, if the Soviet Union has disappeared, why is the world more dangerous? Well, because of terrorism. Terrorism?
Oh.
And they would say, yes, terrorism is a huge problem. And anyway, I went through how people paid money, how people traveled, how they communicated, all the things you'd want to know if you were going to describe the future. And the descriptions that they gave and they describe how it built up over time. So it wasn't just, I would say it's the 25th of April, 2050, but then they would say something, and I would say, well, how did that happen? One of the things, for instance, was I said about medicine, and they told me, well, antibiotic medicine has failed. I couldn't even make sense of that. Of course,
Right.
it's true. Antibiotic medicine, we now have these super bugs, and I said, well, are there any problems medically in this period of time? And well, yes, there are all these epidemics. Epidemics? They said yes. Well, it's going to start with a blood disease which transferred across from primates in Africa, and it spread across the world and killed millions of people. And
that was okay.
So then I went to the deputy director of the National Institutes of Health, and I said to him, do you know anything about a blood disease that crosses over from primates and comes out of West Africa and is going to kill millions of people? And this is about 1979, and he said to me, Stephen, I don't know what you're talking about. No, we don't know anything about that. But of course, in '81, AIDS surfaces, and it killed millions of people.
Right.
So everything that the 2050s have told me has come to pass. The key to this is it's not what one person says. Suppose
it's
outside
quite
of your
few, right?
Yeah, it's about 4,000 people total. But
now,
think
was
of it
there
this way.
any conversation? I'm sorry, I had to jump in here because
No,
was there
right.
any conversation about them actually witnessing that as much as those things are a reality, did they see anything of like a spiritual awakening? Because that's the area that I'm in. Did they see that people were waking up from a deep internal sleep and were becoming more ethical, more value-based, more virtue-based?
Well, I'd love to give you wonderful good news, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Kind of puts me out of business.
Well, no, because what they did say was that there is a change in consciousness that was forced by climate change. Now, I'd never heard of climate change in 1978, 79, 80. I didn't learn about climate change until 1991. So it didn't make any sense to me. Again, and I stress this, it's amazing how quickly things change. So you don't think from 1990 to 2050, I mean, that doesn't seem like such a long time, but massive changes occur. What is happening is that, we touched a little bit on this yesterday, is that there is a shift in consciousness that is occurring as some of the population, but not all of the population, awaken to the idea that the way to deal with climate change is by recognizing that all life is interconnected and interdependent, and that you must design systems that are wellness-oriented, because the unintended consequences that arise from very limited thinking, we'll just pull all of this whatever this material is out of the earth, and that's all we need to worry about. But you don't actually think about, well, what happens to the runoff? What happens to the slag? What happens to the toxins that invade the water system? And so you have to stop that kind of thinking, and you have to begin thinking, what are the implications for well-being of something that you want to do? And the 2050s saw this change of consciousness as finally tipping into the side of the life-affirming, but it has been a very difficult period. I would say that the next, between now and about 2040, it's going to be very difficult. You can look at the United States today. We currently have an administration that doesn't believe climate change exists. They're doing everything in their power to change regulations at the EPA, to eliminate regulations that are designed to limit the amount of toxins that can be released or the amount of CO2 that can be released. So the United States is moving exactly backwards. Other countries are moving forward, but we are becoming increasingly isolated.
That we're seeing.
So we're going to go through a very we're going to go through a very difficult period. Well, I was just going to say by 2050, things seem to be leveling out.
So does the role of religion, meditation, spirituality, is there anything at all involved in the next few decades to come? Because you and I'm pretty sure that when you're going through a very rough period, you find yourself going deeper within and feeling maybe a deeper empathy, even though you're still in motion. Is there any discussion, any amplification that an awakening is going to happen, that religion will begin to work for people, spirituality will begin to work, meditation will begin to work? Or is it too subtle or sublime for them to have witnessed or picked that up in their remote viewing?
No, there is some good news here. Meditation is increasingly in use, and people are instructed in it. I make a very strong distinction between religion and spirituality. So you got to start with that.
Me too.
All religions are man-made, and they all result from a single individual having non-local consciousness experiences, and that person becomes if that person is charismatic, and if they speak in a manner which resonates with the culture in which they are embedded, then they develop disciples, and the disciples then begin creating dogmas and rituals. And so I make a very big distinction between non-local consciousness, which is what traditionally is called spirituality, and religion. I do not see a growth in religion. In fact, quite the opposite. I do see, and the 2050s described, a significant increase in the awareness of consciousness as the fundamental, what you would, I think, probably call spiritual. I think of spirituality or the spiritual as a pre-technological word to describe non-local consciousness experiences. That is, accessing, opening to that part of yourself that is the eternal self, what religion would call the soul, this aspect of you that existed before you were born and will continue after you're physically dead, and that this aspect will episodically manifest other personalities which will in turn incarnate, but that there is this fundamental part of us, the eternal self, which continues and which is not physiologically based. That is, the materialist worldview is dead meat, no consciousness. You die, that's it. The mind is just the result of physiological processes in the neuroanatomy of the organism. And the other view, which I believe is becoming increasingly the prevailing view, although still not the dominant view, is that consciousness is the fundamental. Max Planck, for instance, in 1931, the father of quantum mechanics, they asked him, "What have you learned? You're one of the most famous, he and Einstein, the most famous scientists in the world. What have you learned?" And he said, "What I've learned is that consciousness is fundamental and space-time is a manifestation of consciousness, not consciousness a manifestation of space-time. You cannot get behind consciousness. It is the fundamental." And Einstein asked a similar question, said, Well, you have to recognize that what we call reality is an optical delusion, one of my favorites, and that there is this other aspect. And in fact, most of the individuals, most of the men who were the founders of modern physics, particularly the German school, Planck, Heisenberg, Pauli, Schrödinger, Einstein, they all believe this idea that consciousness, because that's what their research showed them, that consciousness was the fundamental. And I think in order to deal with climate change, we are going to have to open to this aspect of ourselves. We can see, if you look at the scientific literature, that the number of papers being written about meditation not in a religious context, but as a technique for psychophysical self-regulation, there are now well over 1,000 such papers, and that they show enormous changes in your physiology as well as your psychology, and wherever meditation is put into practice in communities, whether it's students in inner city schools or whether it's Marines who are being trained, in the course of their military training, wherever you teach people how to meditate, you improve the quality of their health, their psychology, and their outlook. We know, for instance, that if you do 20 minutes a day of meditation, when you get to about the 11th cumulative hour, that you have significantly changed the structure of your brain. Your prefrontal cortex is thickened, your neuronal activity has significantly increased, your memory increases, your IQ goes up, your blood pressure goes down. All of this is really, when you really get down to what is meditation, what you see is it is intentioned, focused awareness. So the key to all of this is to be able to attain and sustain intentioned, focused awareness. That's why they teach meditation in dojos, military or martial arts dojos, and they teach it in monasteries, because they recognize from both paths that the ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness has a huge importance in coming to truly understand and have control over yourself. We can see this in as I say, in all sorts of applications. It's not inherently religious, although it is often incorporated into religion, because religions all begin because one individual has, as I said, a non-local consciousness experience, and they talk about it, and other people are attracted to it. And if you look at, for instance, all the religious rituals around the world across all of human history, you'll see they have the same elements. It doesn't matter about the dogma part. The actual ritual has the same elements. You gather at the designated place. You know, whether it's an oak grove or whether it's a temple or a synagogue or a mosque or whatever. You gather at the appointed place. You have a statement of group intention. If you're a Christian, it's the Nicene Creed, for instance. So you the group makes a statement of common intention, because this issue of intention is the key to social change and all sorts of other things. You then have a period of singing, dancing, drumming, chanting, and the reason that matters, and we know this from the neuroscience research. There's even a part of neuroscience called neurotheology now that was begun by a man named Andrew Newberg. But the drumming together, chanting together, singing together, dancing together causes brain entraining. That is, everybody's brain begins to entrain, and when that happens, it becomes easier to express group intention. And then you have a period where some, but not all, of the members of the community may or may not, but may have a non-local consciousness experience. Again, if you're a Christian, that would be speaking in tongues, for instance, or in many religions, it would be a healing ceremony. In voodoo, it might be possession by Dr. Dre or whatever. And then you have a homily or some sort of dogma. That's the man-made part. And the recommitment to gather again. But if you really look at what the ritual is about, it's about allowing a small number of the people in the community to have a non-local consciousness experience and report it back to the community as a validation of the truth of what they're doing.
I so understand that, and I think that as the supports, so what I call the scaffolding, begin to break away, there is something that we all have to turn to within ourselves, which might be what you shared, intentionality, where we're going to want to feel at peace with our own story, with our conscience. Mm-hmm. And I'm just aiming for the reality that we are going to step more into integrity, honesty, transparency, lovingness, understanding, acceptance of all, because it's going to be so different. It's going to be so different. It's going to be so backward. And the consciousness is going to want to go forward to sort of create what I would call a golden aged world, a world where there is some resonance of consciousness with everyone collectively, where there's an absence of negativity in one's personality or nature, because they've seen over and over again it doesn't work, it doesn't serve the common good.
Well, I think that what you're saying is correct. I would only modify it, or I guess my comment on it would be, the only way we're going to get through climate change is by awakening to the idea that we are more than animated meat. Because the dominionist view, we have dominion over the earth as if we are somehow separate from it. We don't live on the earth, we live in the earth. There's life miles beneath our feet and miles above our head. We live in the Goldilocks zone on the surface. We are not independent of the great matrix of life. We are just a component in it. And when we recognize that, we recognize that the exploitation of another component is not without consequence. So the only way humanity is going to get through climate change and retain civilization is by this awakening process. We have this capacity. I do say to people, I've been teaching meditation I'm a daily meditator for almost 60 years now, and I say to people that the greatest gift you can give yourself is to develop the daily practice of meditation. How you do it is much less important than that you do it. So it's not that there's a technique, you find a technique that works for you, that satisfies your emotional and inner needs, and the key to it is that you practice it every day. And if you will do that, as I said, the scientific research is absolutely clear about what comes out of that. I mean, you get smarter, you sleep better, your health is better. I mean, every aspect of your life will improve. There is no greater gift you can give yourself as a person than to develop the daily practice of meditation. And the evidence for that is just overwhelming.
Right. I'm so glad that you said that.
It's just, I am a data person.
Yeah.
So what I care about is the data. Is this, not do I claim this, not do I speculate this, not do I wish this, what actually happens when you do it? And when you look at the research data on meditation, mindfulness meditation, whatever you call it, what you see is that those people who practice it every day have a substantively different course of life than those that do not. It's more life-affirming, it's more wellness-oriented, you recognize your interdependence and interconnection with other life forms, so you become an environmentalist. I mean, all of those things. There just isn't anything more important than developing the daily practice of meditation.
Stephan, I can't let you go until I have you share a little bit more about your new book, The 8 Laws of Change, and you include a pledge for people to take when making decisions. Could you share with our listeners pledge and how it can perhaps help them make the world better?
Well, this actually is a continuation of the conversation we've just been having, Sister Jenna. I mean, what happens is that meditation and focusing on this eternal aspect of yourself is an individual act, but it has social consequences. When large numbers of people hold a common intention, things change. And you can look at changes in smoking, you can look at gender equality, you can look at marriage equality, you can look at a whole raft of social behaviors which were at one time acceptable, but which are no longer acceptable, not because anybody passed a law about it, but because individuals collectively decide, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to think that, I'm not going to hold that point of view. And so the technique that I developed and discuss in the 8 Laws of Change, which is the book that I wrote to tell people, do not despair, do not feel unempowered, do not feel that you can't make a difference, because the truth is there is no force on earth more powerful than the collective intention of a large number of people. And so I wrote a book which is science-based about how to do that, not based on my theory or my religion or my speculations, but on the actual research that shows us if you do this, this is what you get. And the point that you're making, the quotidian pledge, quotidian just means mundane, ordinary, daily. That's why I use that word. And I called it quotidian rather than mundane, ordinary, because I wanted it to have a word that would make it sort of stick in people's minds. And basically all it says, it's very simple. It doesn't require any money. It doesn't require power in the official sense. It doesn't require that you come from a wealthy family or any of that. Every individual has this power, and that is every day you make dozens of choices. You make choices about the toothpaste you use. You make choices about the dog food you feed your dog. You make choices about the paper towels that you buy, and on and on and on. So first of all, be aware you're making choices. And second of all, of the choices that are available to you, consistently and universally always choose that option which is the most compassionate and life-affirming as you understand it in that moment. So every time you are faced with a choice, you have options. Now, it may be that none of the options are very good, but inevitably one is always slightly better than the others. And if you will consistently make the compassionate, life-affirming choice, choose that option, and you will share with other people that you are doing this as a discipline and invite them to join you, very quickly you can create the circumstances which create social change. Because, well, just start with 1,000 people. If 1,000 people who are listening to us now, I mean, you have a lot more than 1,000 people, but if only 1,000 people out of all the people that are listening to this conversation now would make this commitment and tell 10 of their friends that they're doing it and invite them to do the same, well, then we would go from 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 to 1 million to 10 million to 100 million. And so in 5 jumps, we would have gone from 1,000 people to about a third of the population of the country. I tell this to people all the time, and it just seems so simple that can't possibly work. But in fact, if you look at how Gandhi was able to get independence for India or Martin Luther King was able to get civil rights through, that is exactly what happened.
Right,
You've got individual people to make different choices.
Now, can I jump in here because I know we have to come to a closure and I could listen to you all day. We've got social media now. So we've got people looking at things at high volumes and perhaps experiencing what they're witnessing. Is that creating a change as well? Because it seems to be a little different. I mean, if we have back in the days of Gandhi or King and that social, collective, human vibration was making a change, will it still be as effective at a virtual level as well?
Yes, but it depends. The problem is that you have to make the commitment that you are focused on that which is compassionate and life-affirming. That the social media is a process which is enormously powerful, but it doesn't have inherently any particular life-affirming value. That is, you could develop a social media thing that was promoting pornography, for instance. It's the social media part is the process. The individual responsibility is when you engage in this social process, are you doing so to create enhanced well-being, or are you doing it so that you can make profit, or so you can get revenge on somebody, or so you can hurt somebody? I mean, that is the choice. The process is neutral. You could use it for good or ill. The strength of social media is that it now allows us to communicate a common intention at an enormously speeded up rate from what was possible in the past, but it does not inherently involve wellness. That is the thing the individual brings to the process. And so those processes which are guided by wellness and a fostering of well-being from the individual to the family, to the community, to the nation, to the planet itself, those things can create enormous positive change.
I like that. I love that. That's a positive note for us to end our conversation on, because I think that we get a little bit disheartened when, I can't say for myself, because I'm from a different genre of consciousness, but I do know that one of the reasons why folks don't usually like to tell too much to average folks is the fear that they won't be able to manage it, they won't be able to deal with it. And I think that you ending this narrative on a very positive note makes it hopeful, shall we say.
It should be hopeful. Everybody listening to this has the power to create positive, life-affirming change. It doesn't require money. That's the point. It's not about how the world views power externally. It's how you as an individual, what you commit yourself to be in support of, and if your intention is to be in support of that which is compassionate and life-affirming, you have the power to change the world.
Beautiful, beautiful. Stephan, thank you so much for reminding us about the things that we need to do for ourselves, the things that we need to look forward to, but that also being in a good and a pure intention and making that as a collective contribution will definitely warrant the manifestation of where that intention is in each of us. So thank you so much. Please leave our listeners with where they can get a copy of your latest book, and anytime you have any real amazing stories to tell us, do not hesitate to come on the air.
Okay, thank you. Well, you want to go to StephanASchwartz.com, StephanASchwartz.com, or you can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble. It's called The 8 Laws of Change, and it will tell you exactly how to use science-based processes to create life-affirming change. That's why I wrote it. It is written in such a way that anybody can understand it. These are very simple and straightforward things that people have a hard time believing that they can actually do it, but the book also gives you examples of people just like you who have tried this and made it work and changed the world.
Thank you so much. Stephan Schwartz, thank you for joining us on the America Meditating Radio. All the very best.
My pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye. So as we've heard so much from Stephan about the changes that are going to come, and I think many of us were very sensitive. We can also feel those changes. And so as we're feeling them, to me the direction that we must take is the direction of internal empowerment, inner reconnection to a spirit of innocence, a spirit of power, to become a force, but a gentle force, something that really navigates us through times that are just not fitting for the spirit. But nonetheless, we're going to push ourselves through to our best ability. Well, thank you for joining us. Remember, no one can take away your happiness unless you give them permission, and we are here to love each other the same. So So let's end our wonderful conversation with one of these beautiful tracks by Kristen Hoffman. Take care, everyone.
Feel the silence take you under, take you in, and then the sirens scream through the air, calling you back to the fight, like a shockwave straight through your heart, wanting you back to life. Let me fall into nothing, like a picture out of focus. Cut the line up the river. You are floating like a vision back in, and then the sirens scream through the air, calling you back to the fight, like a shockwave straight through your heart, wanting you back, and then the tears flow like signals in smoke, calling you back to the light. Feel the whispers tangle your soul, wanting you back. Letting go of time, walking past the signs, the shedding of the mind. Oh, don't you bring me back to life, and then the sirens scream through the air, calling you back to the fight, like a shockwave straight through your heart, wanting you back.